The shelter looks almost perfect. Its walls are thick. The entrance is small. The wind has nearly vanished. Inside, a stove throws a soft orange light across the snow. For someone who has spent hours in the cold, this is the image of safety, a sealed pocket of warmth in a landscape that wants to take it away. But one detail changes the meaning of the entire scene. The vent above the stove is closing. Fresh snow is filling it from the outside slowly enough that no one inside would notice. The shelter is becoming warmer, quieter, and more dangerous. Snow caves, tents, and igloos need adequate ventilation, especially when combustion is involved. Cooking can consume oxygen, and carbon monoxide can accumulate without announcing itself. That contradiction exposes the central problem with most survival advice. A shelter is often judged by its shape: lean-to, debris hut, snow cave, tent, cabin. But the shape is only the visible part. What keeps a person alive is a system of heat, moisture, wind, ground, air, fuel, and time. Change one of those variables, and a method that worked for someone else may fail for you. This investigation is not a guide to building an emergency shelter. It is an attempt to recover the physical principles hidden inside old methods, and to identify the conditions their modern retellings leave out, because cold does not need a dramatic blizzard to become dangerous. Hypothermia can occur even above 40 degrees Fahrenheit when rain, sweat, or cold water leaves a person chilled. The first question then is not, which shelter should you copy? It is, what is taking your heat right now? Imagine two people in the same forest at the same temperature. One is standing behind a windbreak in dry clothing. The other is sitting on frozen ground after sweating through a base layer. They occupy the same weather, but they are not facing the same thermal problem. Cold reaches the body through several paths. Contact with cold surfaces draws heat by conduction. Moving air strips away the warmer layer near the body through convection. Wet clothing and immersion accelerate the loss. The body also continues radiating heat, while exhaustion and depleted energy make it harder to replace what is leaving. Official medical guidance emphasizes that wet clothing, water exposure, and wind can accelerate cooling, and that remaining dry is a central control. This is why the phrase "build a shelter" is incomplete. A roof may stop snowfall while doing nothing about the frozen surface underneath. A wall may block wind while trapping moisture. A fire may add heat while creating smoke, sparks, or an air quality hazard. A small sealed space may conserve warmth but remove the margin for combustion. The visible object is not the solution. The balance is. Consider what happens during construction. A person begins cold, then works hard enough to cut, dig, lift, and carry. Internal heat rises. Clothing that was appropriate while standing becomes too warm under effort. Moisture builds quietly. When the work ends, heat production drops, but the moisture remains. The shelter can be structurally complete at the exact moment the occupant's thermal position becomes worse. This is the difference between a static design and a lived system. Diagrams freeze every variable. Real nights do not. The body changes. The weather changes. Materials compress. Fuel runs down. Attention fades. A trustworthy explanation has to follow those changes instead of presenting the finished structure as a victory frame. Older shelter traditions often appear remarkably efficient because they were embedded in routines that disappear when the design is reduced to a photograph. Materials were gathered before darkness. Clothing was managed to limit sweat. Bedding separated the sleeper from the earth. Openings were adjusted as weather changed. Someone remained alert to the fire. The method was not merely a structure. It was work performed through the night. That distinction matters to a modern viewer. A historical example can reveal a principle without becoming a safe recipe. The people who used these systems knew their local materials, their prevailing winds, and the consequences of getting the sequence wrong. Copying the shape without that knowledge copies only the surface, and the most commonly ignored surface is the one beneath the body. In photographs, the roof dominates. It is the part that looks protective. It holds back snow and rain. It creates the silhouette we recognize as a shelter. So when people imagine improving one, they often add more material overhead. But a sleeping person is not only losing heat to the sky. The ground is a vast cold mass in direct contact with the shelter floor. Without separation, the body warms the surface below, and the surface continues pulling energy away. The U.S. Army describes sleeping mats as ground insulation beneath a sleep system. That is not a glamorous lesson. It does not produce the most dramatic image, yet it explains why a crude-looking shelter with dry, substantial bedding can outperform a beautiful structure with a bare floor. The deeper principle is separation. Separate the body from cold ground. Separate insulation from moisture. Separate the sleeping area from uncontrolled combustion. Separate incoming air from exhaust. Separate a proven physical mechanism from the mythology attached to the person who used it. Now imagine replacing dry bedding with material gathered from beneath wet snow. From a distance, the volume may look the same. On camera, both layers can appear thick, but thickness alone does not tell us how much air the material traps, how quickly it compresses, or what contact with moisture does over time. The lesson is not that natural material always works or always fails. The lesson is that the word insulation hides properties that must be examined. This is why responsible reconstruction needs an inventory: material, condition, depth, placement, exposure, and expected duration. Without that inventory, a visual resemblance can be mistaken for functional equivalence. Army survival doctrine also treats insulation as a measurable requirement rather than a decorative layer. Its cold shelter guidance describes substantial insulation and insists that ventilation openings remain clear when heat-producing devices are used. The precise dimensions in any field manual belong to the conditions and design that manual describes. They should not be turned into a universal number. Snow density changes, vegetation changes, wind changes, moisture changes. A shelter that settles through the night is not the same shelter that was completed at sunset. So the transferable lesson is not use exactly this many inches. It is that insulation needs depth, continuity, dryness, and maintenance, and that retaining heat never cancels the need to breathe. That creates the next contradiction. The better a shelter becomes at holding warmth, the more carefully its air must be managed. There is a moment in many winter shelter stories when the work appears finished. The opening is closed. Loose gaps are packed. The interior begins to warm. The builder finally stops moving, but a winter shelter does not remain finished. Snow drifts. Wind changes direction. Warm interior air carries moisture. Roof surfaces soften and refreeze. Clothing releases the sweat accumulated during construction. A vent that was open an hour ago can narrow. An entrance that was clear can become partially buried. The National Park Service warns that winter shelters need adequate ventilation, and that vents may need to be cleared during snowy or windy conditions. It also warns that cooking inside consumes oxygen rapidly and can create a carbon monoxide hazard. This does not mean every shelter should be cold or wide open. It means ventilation is not an optional hole added at the end. It is a continuing function. The old fantasy is that survival skill defeats the environment once. The real task is monitoring a system that continues to change. That is also why warmth can be misleading. A person may interpret rising temperature as proof that every decision was correct. But the sensation of comfort does not measure oxygen, carbon monoxide, condensation inside insulation, structural loading, or the state of the exit. The camera sees a peaceful orange glow. Physics sees several processes moving at once. Sound can make the illusion even stronger. Wind disappears behind thick walls. Snow absorbs distant noise. The occupant hears the stove and little else. Quiet feels controlled. Yet quiet cannot reveal whether a vent is narrowing or moisture is accumulating where it cannot be seen. A documentary can use that contrast without manufacturing danger. Hold the camera on the existing vent. Show snow already moving across its edge. Let the fire remain steady. Nothing needs to appear, attack, or transform. The tension comes from understanding the same image differently after the evidence is introduced. This is where responsible survival storytelling must slow down. A dramatic shortcut, sealing every gap, bringing a flame inside, building beneath an unstable load, can look convincing for the exact minutes needed to film it. The danger may arrive after the demonstration ends. A documentary should therefore ask a different question from a tutorial. Not, did it look successful on camera? But what would continue happening if the camera stayed for 12 hours? Once the personalities and legends are removed, the old methods become less romantic and more useful. They reveal a small set of recurring concerns. Wind has to be controlled because moving air accelerates convective heat loss. Moisture has to be managed because wet clothing and water contact increase cooling. The sleeper has to be separated from the ground because contact creates a conductive path. Insulation has to possess real depth and remain effective in the conditions where it is used. Airflow has to remain adequate, particularly around any combustion source. None of these principles belongs to a single historical character. None requires an invented grandfather, a secret tribe, or a forbidden manual. They are physical constraints. What makes these methods worth studying is not their costume. It is the mechanism beneath it. Thicker walls can preserve heat, but without managed airflow, the same enclosure can preserve something else, contaminated air. A roof can protect the sleeper from falling snow, but without separation from the ground, the body remains connected to an enormous cold mass. An old design may appear to have survived unchanged for generations, but photographs preserve structures more easily than routines. They rarely show who checked the opening at midnight, replaced compressed bedding, dried clothing, managed fuel, or abandoned a site when conditions changed. That creates a problem of memory. Successful methods leave shelters, drawings, names, and stories. Failed attempts often leave no teacher. What reaches us is not a complete experiment. It is a record shaped by survival, repetition, local knowledge, and the details someone thought worth preserving. So historical evidence becomes more useful when its claims become narrower. This wall controlled wind in this landscape. This bedding separated a sleeper from this ground. This opening managed air while someone continued watching it. Those statements are less dramatic than a universal survival secret. They are also more honest and more portable. A field checklist can preserve that honesty. It cannot promise that one shelter will defeat every environment. It can force the missing variables back into view before confidence becomes commitment. I turned this 8-system check into a practical field manual, built to turn scattered advice into a clear preparedness plan. It includes an action toolkit, quick start guide, and printable field cards. Scan the code or visit martinkellan.shop. Now, back to the shelter. The reason is already visible in the opening scene. Nothing spectacular needs to happen. The danger is contained in an ordinary image that has not yet been read correctly. The shelter exists. The fire still burns. The tracks lead away, and one vent is slowly disappearing beneath the snow. So what survives the evidence test? Not one universal shelter, not one forgotten trick. What survives is a sequence of questions. What is the immediate source of heat loss? Wind, wet clothing, cold ground, exposure, or a combination? What material is actually available, and how does it behave when wet? What separates the body from the ground? What keeps precipitation out without trapping dangerous moisture? How will air enter and leave? Is combustion involved, and if so, how is the associated risk controlled? Can the exit and ventilation remain usable if snow accumulates? What changes after construction stops? These questions do not replace professional training, local guidance, weather information, or emergency judgment. They expose why copying a design from a video is not enough. Cold illness can begin outside the conditions people imagine as extreme, especially when moisture is involved. A shelter that does not address the active heat loss mechanism can create confidence without creating protection. The most valuable historical methods were never magic. They were conditional answers to specific landscapes, materials, and routines. Our task is not to reenact their surface. It is to identify the principle, verify it against current sources, and state the limits as clearly as the promise. That is what the field checklist at the end of this investigation should become. Not a set of construction instructions, but a decision framework. Wind, moisture, ground, insulation, ventilation, exit, change over time. 8 questions before a person mistakes enclosure for safety. The shelter in the opening did not fail because it was old. It failed because one part of its system was treated as invisible. The wind was outside. The danger was already within.